Hello, it's Employee a Million, and welcome back to SpongeComs. Today's commentary track is for the SpongeBob SquarePants movie. That little Nickelodeon Movies jingle was just for you to have a little sync-up test so that you can listen to me commentate over the movie while you're watching it. And just to get some preliminary information out of the way, the SpongeBob SquarePants movie premiered at the Grauman's Chinese Theatre on November 14th, 2004, before premiering across the rest of the US on November 19th, 2004. And it grossed around $231 million against an estimated $70 million budget, and that's a higher estimate. The movie was written by Stephen Hillenburg, Derek Dreiman, Tim Hill, Kent Osborne, Aaron Springer, and Paul Tibbitt, and storyboarded by Sherm Cohen, Caleb Mura, Tuck Tucker, Mike Roth, and Eric Weiss. And the very interesting thing is that this movie isn't as much of an end of an era / passing of the torch as you'd think in these sorts of higher up facilities, because a lot of the people who wrote and boarded the movie stayed on for season 4, but a few key players did leave, including Stephen Hillenburg and Derek Dreiman and Caleb Mura as a storyboard artist, and Mike Roth briefly before returning for the season 6 special SpongeBob vs. the Big One. Everyone else, like Kent Osborne, Aaron Springer, Sherm Cohen, Caleb Mura, and Eric Weiss, sort of stuck around. Tuck Tucker actually joined SpongeBob with the movie, and Paul Tibbitt famously stuck around and succeeded Stephen Hillenburg as the showrunner for the series going into season 4. And I guess to know more about its placement in SpongeBob history, I guess it's fair to just talk about how this movie came to be. A SpongeBob movie was considered as early as 2001, at the peak of that whole cartoon movie adaptation trend. Nickelodeon was making bank off the Rugrats movies. They had a Jimmy Neutron and Hey Arnold one ready to go, but Stephen Hillenburg refused for about a year because he didn't know if SpongeBob could work in that long of a format, because, well, they were already struggling to do the half-hour specials, just sort of taking these average stories and gussying them up with patchy segments and songs. But yeah, he always thought that the show worked best in a shorter format, so, these movie offers really, got him to think, how do I do it? And he watched Toy Story and the Iron Giant with his son, and eventually settled on the idea of SpongeBob and Patrick going on a road trip. And that's a common thing you see in a lot of animated movies. They go for not always a road trip per se, but exploring the world. You see that in The Simpsons movie most famously. And it's a safe way to take the characters outside of their comfort zone while also briefly showing off the area on the big screen, and then a new area with a new challenge for the characters. So it's often pretty effective. So even though the movie had about 2 years to be made, or around 2.5, the show had to be put on hiatus in the summer of 2002 so that as much effort can be put into the movie as possible. And this really shocked the SpongeBob fan base for a little bit, because SpongeBob's popularity was just soaring higher and higher every day, it seemed. And now there wouldn't be that many new episodes for the foreseeable future. Around July of 2002, Nick had about 10 episodes left to air across another 2 years, so people got really thirsty for more SpongeBob content, and that first era of SpongeBob, those first 3 seasons, now called the pre-movie era, just became a lot more established and classic, even within that 2-year break, because, for as beloved and sacred as they are now, there was sort of a sanctity to them as build-up for the movie increased. This is a good show. Let's see if this is a good movie. And I'll get to critical reception much, much later. But Nickelodeon must have known that a lot of fans would be eagerly, speculating what the movie could possibly be about. How could they do a SpongeBob movie, honestly? And so, around early 2003, a bit of a fake leaked plot started circulating the internet, and it was that SpongeBob was journeying the ocean to save Patrick from a fisherman who's taken him to Florida. And the thing that kind of blew it is that this is almost exactly the same setup as Finding Nemo, a Pixar movie that was set to release that year, that was also about fish journeying to land to rescue one of their own from some place like Florida. Sydney's kind of like Florida, isn't it? But the SpongeBob movie actually was quite similar to Finding Nemo in a few ways. Like, SpongeBob is joined by Patrick in the movie, but it's kind of interesting that they chose to highlight both SpongeBob and Patrick and to bring up a fisherman, because even though a fisherman has a very small role or sort of a cameo towards the end of the movie, I think that might have morphed into the idea of the Cyclops. I don't know. But then the movie was written and boarded by those five guys in 3 months in one room in Glendale, California. And in an interview around the time the movie released, Kent Osborne helpfully noted in an interview that it got gamey in there. So thanks for that, Kent Osborne. One weird little fun fact about the movie is that storyboards were marked with a Peanut Worms Productions logo. They made up a whole new logo for United Plankton Pictures to throw people off their scent and to maintain absolute secrecy with details about the movie. And I kind of get why they did that, because, well, if something leaks, then, I don't know, that could cut into excitement for the movie. One quite tragic thing for the creative team personally was that while the movie was in the early production stages, Steven Hillenburg's mentor at CalArts, Jules Engel, passed away in September. And I just want to dedicate a little bit of this commentary track just to talk about Jules and how much of an influence he was on that early generation of CalArts, like opening up the experimental division at CalArts. And like, he worked on some quite amazing things in some quite amazing fields for a couple decades there. He was a painter for Disney dating back to 1938, and he left during the strike, but he got to have some sort of credit on Fantasia and Bambi, and then he went to work for UPA for a couple decades and worked on some pretty interesting stuff there. And then when CalArts opened, he mentored a lot of that early generation of CalArts students, like Steven Hillenburg, Mark Kirkland, and just sort of I don't want to just think of him as a name at the end of the movie, because he was pretty important in sort of shaping the Proterozoic inspirations for the intertidal zone and then SpongeBob. And yeah, he is sorely missed by everyone that knew him, and I just wanted to get that out of the way. Now time to talk about things actually going on in the movie. So I'm a couple minutes behind on this, but the pirate opening's great. Always loved it. I think if you have a pirate opening to the show with Painty the Pirate, and you get the specials to open, well, most of the specials to open with Patchy the Pirate, then it's probably for the best that you do that in a movie format too. And they went all out. They got this big old score going. They've got this quite impressive set for the boat. It's surprising how well it's held up. I know they're probably filming it just off a coast somewhere, but it really does feel massive, like you're out in the ocean with this group of pirates. I don't know when or how it was filmed, but it does look pretty nifty to this day. And I always found the chief, the captain of that ship, to be quite intimidating. He's not as friendly as Patchy, but I could make the argument that maybe it's Patchy in the future. Maybe he got a pirate crew finally. Chief evidence for this being that he also has an eye patch and that he also has a talking bird played by Steven Hillenberg. The guy who says "shut up and look at the screen" here hasn't got a name really, but it's not Party. Maybe he just has an affinity for that voice, being a SpongeBob fan. I don't know how that could possibly work out. And just the theatrical rearrangement of the SpongeBob theme is also really fun to listen to. It just really gets you in the mood for a SpongeBob adventure, and that's what this is, an action adventure movie. It's certainly a comedy as well, but they're doing something a bit grander with these characters, so it's good that they set that up there. The little the little cinema sets that they whipped up were also pretty nice to see too. And then just going straight to the island and then down, and then they throw you another curveball. Now it's a sort of a crime thing. You've got police showing up and SpongeBob in these snazzy boots looking all grim and serious, completely going against how he's marketed and seen by the general public as this sort of weird cop figure. And Tom Kenny really sells it with his sort of deadpan performance for that first little bit. As a matter of fact, the first joke in this movie that feels like a SpongeBob joke is Phil sort of crying over thinking about his family. And isn't that odd that the most SpongeBob-y joke at that point is some guy crying over his family, and you don't get the context that he's not really crying over anything that serious? And also just the zoom into the cheese is also great. And I know that little trumpety musical chord that they got for that zoom in must have been pretty easy to find at APM or somewhere, but they just picked the perfect one. It's excellent. I remember seeing the storyboard on the DVD a couple years ago, and it didn't have that yet, and it didn't have SpongeBob smiling when he said "order up." It was a lot more serious there, a little more, and I'm just kind of glad that they made it more comedic in the final mix or whatever. There's a few little things about SpongeBob's morning routine that are also pretty nice. You've got Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy making a few cameos. You've got it canonical that SpongeBob eats soap to freshen up and, brushes his eyes with his toothbrush and toothpaste. That's kind of weird, but SpongeBob's a kind of weird character. And at this point in the SpongeBob timeline, he's been working at the Krusty Krab for 374 consecutive months, at the very least, because I don't know how the events of Employee of the Month shook out for him and his Employee of the Month track record. But that adds up to about 31 years, so if we stick with the assumption that SpongeBob joined the Krusty Krab for some reason on the exact day the show started, May 1st, 1999, then this movie might be set in July 2030 or later. So I know it's just sort of an exaggerative joke, but it kind of confirms that this is pretty far into the SpongeBob timeline. Steven Hillenberg liked to say that it was at the very end, no matter what SpongeBob productions came after this. And I can definitely take his word for that, because, no matter what happens to the show, this will always feel like what everything is building up to for these characters. Well, not all of these characters. There are a few that are kind of left out, but, for SpongeBob and Patrick and Mr. Krabs and Plankton especially, this kind of feels like where they were headed. Another thing that kind of makes this feel like it's set a little later is that we hardly ever saw Goofy Goober products in the show, even after the idea was introduced in this movie. And that's kind of because there was sort of a lock between Nickelodeon and Paramount in terms of who could get to use assets made for the movie. Like, you didn't see Neptune's crown in the show anymore. You didn't see this incarnation of Neptune. You didn't see any sort of reference to Shell City. You did see one little reference to Goofy Goober in Chimps Ahoy in season 4, but it's just the Goofy Goober logo on a back scratcher, and that's it. Until about season 11, when they introduced the Goofy Goober ice cream boat in Patnocchio, I want to say. And I'm kind of happy that it's back. Kind of puts into a new context that it's been quite a while since we've seen that, and maybe that's just further in the timeline that it was an established business or whatever. And another very interesting thing about how movie assets were locked away is that this movie featured the debut of Perch Perkins, this sort of news reporter, and he's purple in the movie but orange in the show. And this isn't the first time that fishes have changed color, because, fun fact, some fishes can change color in real life. I don't know if that was intentional, but it's just a funny little thing. The very interesting thing about that is, you've got this character that is now kind of iconic and well remembered, and he's introduced in the movie. Like, he wasn't seen in any episode prior to this, and then in season 4 he just started showing up regularly. And I don't mind him as a character in any way, but it sort of feels like they threw realistic fish head to the wayside, because he's a much more goofy and surreal addition to the show. Like, you'd still see him occasionally in episodes like Once Bitten, but I don't know. This also featured the debut of Karen's mobile form, which first appeared here, took a bit of a break in season 4, but then became basically her de facto form from season 5 onward. And now it's kind of hard to imagine her outside of her mobile form, especially since they've further anthropomorphized her as the years have gone on. And, this is a change that I kind of like. It's not like SpongeBob's bigger cheeks in this movie that, can make him look kind of unappealing at times. I think that they found a way to make the character more useful and more versatile, and it kind of makes me happy that the show went on a little longer, because then we got to see Karen as a more active character, and I can dig that. But about her husband, Plankton, oh boy, this is a very different look for him, isn't it? I can kind of buy that this is the end of the timeline also, because Plankton is just completely and utterly insane in this movie. He's just completely, just got veins popping out of him every chance they get, and laughing maniacally, and he was a much more sort of cunning villain before this, sort of a sneakier villain, and he had flashes of a god complex in his fantasy and fun and his dream and sleepy time, but they sort of made a point to humanize him to some extent. But here he's a completely ruthless dictator in the making, and very manipulative, very in your face about how evil he is. And I mean, there is a bit of an issue with that when you apply it to any form of character growth he could go through in either earlier episodes or even later projects like Friend or Foe or The Other Patty or Sponge Out of Water. You just kind of have to ignore those and pretend that he didn't learn anything from those. And yeah, I think that can kind of suck for Plankton. Plankton's a good guy deep down, people. But it's for the context of the movie. I can kind of buy that, and I can kind of buy this being him just on his final straw. And I guess it's kind of interesting that Plankton had only had 25 plans by this point, because Plan Z is supposedly his 26th, but I mean, the show's been on for nearly 25 years now. Today is its 24th anniversary, and I chose to do the movie on the 24th anniversary because there are a few numbers out there funnier than 24, but the show's been on for 24 years. Obviously, Plankton has appeared in more than one episode a year, so he's had well over, like, just a simple file sort of number of plans. But he had actually had a little less than 20 by the end of season 3, so it was sort of believable in the sense of SpongeBob still being a relatively new show. And it's also kind of odd that the letter Z is only something he could dream of. Remember, he says zap in his dream and sleepy time, so he had to have had some sort of comprehension that there was a 26th letter of the alphabet and a 26th possible plan in his file cabinet. How did that even come about if he doesn't remember the letter Z? It's just a sort of weird thing to fuss over, and that's why I'm doing that in this commentary. But it's sort of odd that they chose to do this with Plankton, but it's also kind of nice to know that, well, they could have, like, made a lot of other characters, like, a bit more forced for this movie, so to say, but didn't. Because even though the cast of SpongeBob characters relevant to the plot of the movie is pretty slim. You've only got SpongeBob and Patrick as the heroes, Mr. Krabs as the dude in distress, you've got Plankton as the villain, and you've got Squidward sort of as getting into a point of intrigue and then being enslaved. And, you know, Squidward has a couple good lines in here, but this isn't a Squidward movie. Sponge on the Run is ironically the closest we've ever gotten, so that's kind of disappointing. But, like, all the other SpongeBob characters, besides those 5, were not given a lot to do in this movie. Like, Karen also has a couple good bits, but you've also just got Sandy and Mrs. Puff only having 2 lines each, and yeah, it is kind of disappointing that they don't really have much to do, especially since they're some of the only female characters. I know that this is a movie somewhat about manhood, but come on, give them some time to shine. And hey, I mean, another good reason why season 4 should exist. Just give them a bit more screen time. And, like, even Gary gets more lines. He gets 3 Meowsen and a Meow Langton in the middle. And I just want to say that Pearl, especially, was done really dirty. Only 2 words in the entire movie, and her voice actress, Laurie Allen, isn't even credited as a key cast member. That, I'm just gonna say it, that sucks. Especially considering Steven Hillenburg was always kind of keen to make some Pearl episodes, but, you know, it's a movie, you gotta keep things focused. I can kind of get why they're doing this. But it also is sort of a thing that you've got a lot of celebrities playing characters in this movie. You've got Jeffrey Tambor as a brand new King Neptune. You've got Scarlett Johansson as Mindy the Mermaid. You've got Avril Lavigne around this time making a cover of the SpongeBob theme song, which I get why Scarlett's here, also getting, like, the trendy teen audience. You've also got Alec Baldwin playing Dennis later in the movie. You've got David Hasselhoff making a cameo as himself. And, I mean, the list, it isn't my favorite, like, grab bag of celebrities. I think with Jeffrey Tambor especially, no matter what you think of him, there's no reason they couldn't have just gotten Jeff O'Hurley, because I know this is kind of a different Neptune, but he plays Neptune in the show and is already sort of a well-known actor. Like, you could put him on the poster, maybe boost his theatrical career. But Scarlett Johansson, I totally get. It's sort of a like trendy, modern pick, and Scarlett Johansson is still kind of relevant in some areas, but I don't know. I don't think she adds or subtracts much to Mindy as a character. They could have gotten Carolyn Lawrence to play her, and I don't know. It wouldn't have been that different. I kind of like that even though this is a SpongeBob movie, it tried to get a PG rating, and this was back at a time when a PG rating didn't mean kids movie. It meant that it was a kids movie with a little bit of, you know, a little bit of meat on its bones. Like this was an era of movies like Shrek and The Incredibles, these movies that had this sort of edgy tone to them and tackled some pretty mature themes. And yeah, SpongeBob movie is kind of that too, because not far into the movie, you get to see SpongeBob and Patrick getting quote unquote wasted on some ice cream. And like, as a kid, you don't get it. Like, I was very young when I first saw this movie, and I did not get it at all. I just thought that, you know, a total sugar rush. They even somehow got this disgruntled ice cream vendor to get them to play a song, a little ditty called Waiter for him. That's great. And from what I've heard, Steven Hillenburg never really drank alcohol, so this is probably some other writer just putting their own experiences in there. I just kind of find that a funny idea. Uh, and But, you know, getting to see a drunk SpongeBob is kind of fun. You get to see him wake up from a hangover. You get to see him sort of yell at his boss without any sense of lucidity as to what's going on. Why his boss is getting, like, about to get roasted by the king of the sea. It's pretty fun. And, I mean, it's also sort of setting up that SpongeBob, even when he's trying to, like, do a more grown-up thing, like just have a night out with his bud, he ends up being pretty childish, just blowing that massive raspberry at the end, and just that generally unprofessional behavior in front of his boss. It's sort of endearing in a way. Super endearing to see your favorite cartoon character drunkenly rant at his boss of 31 years. But I mean, it's super funny how quickly he snaps out of it. It is basically his old peppy self again, and like every scene where SpongeBob is confronting some sort of authority figure, like Mr. Krabs or King Neptune or the Hillbillies coming up in this next scene, he has to prove that he is not a kid. And the debate of SpongeBob's age has basically been going on since the fall of Rome, but I'll always choose to believe that SpongeBob is a man-child. He has, like, the thinking capacity of a grown-up. He has, like, the ability to hold down a job. He has the ability to, you know, rent a house. He has the, like, the age and the wisdom to do that, but just chooses to act like a total kid. And that's a big thing about SpongeBob as a franchise that I personally feel it's a show about happiness, and this is SpongeBob's kind of happiness, is sort of just living a simple life and having a very carefree, innocent outlook on the world, and that's his happiness, and that's the happiness of a kid. And I'll probably talk about it again sometime later on, but that's what this movie is about. It's about SpongeBob sort of being tested by all these different people and places throughout the movie to grow up, get a backbone, or sort of stop having that sort of childish carefree fun that he was born to have. And well, nothing ever breaks him. He's always the same character, and that's kind of interesting. That's kind of endearing that he's going on this massive quest and not really learning anything new about himself. They spend the end of the movie reaffirming that he does not learn anything through his experience. He is who he is, and that's kind of interesting. It's not exactly the sort of gotten off a shelf, be yourself message that you see in a lot of kids' movies. It's a bit more complicated than that. It's a world that wants SpongeBob to be something that he isn't, and SpongeBob ain't having it. The show writers ain't having it. He can be a kid at heart forever, and yet nothing can stop that. A little bit of production information about the Paddy Wagon is that I've got this little color sheet from the SpongeBob production art community on Discord that says that it was patched out on November 18th, 2003, so I don't know exactly what scenes could have been, produced around that time, but yeah, animation on the movie had begun by November of 2003, so that's a nice little fun fact for you, ain't it? And, well, even though SpongeBob as a series would sort of be out of production for around 2 years between Pranks-A-Lot and SpongeBob Meets the Strangler in 2002 and Fear of a Krabby Patty pretty late in 2004, the franchise still continued. It was more popular than it ever would be again, and a few little animated shorts were created from time to time, like for the 2004 Kids' Choice Awards. They did a little intro for Serena Williams where she swallows plankton in a glass. It's kind of weird, but glad to see that they still had time to make some sort of TV level animation for SpongeBob in the time they were patching out the movie. They also did a fully within the movie's animation look, a little animated segment for the YTV interview show, The Zone, where they get Carlos to go down in a quote-unquote bathysphere and interview SpongeBob and Patrick, and they think it's some sort of alien. It's kind of funny, and then Carlos says, "Okay, I'm very excited for your movie, goodbye," and they go, "Goodbye." What movie? What is he talking about? It's pretty funny. I might have to link it in the description again. One last little bit of animation during this time period that I want to bring up is the commercials that Sherm Cohen boarded for Burger King. Just the commercials for the toys they sold at Burger King to promote the movie. And I think that these shorts are pretty charming. As much as I love the look of season 4 as a season, as sort of a slight reinvigoration of the SpongeBob art style, I do really like the look of those shorts, and kind of makes me wish that there was an alternate timeline out there where Sherm Cohen took over the show instead of Paul Tibbitt. For as much as I respect Paul Tibbitt for taking up the mantle and keeping at it for all those years, I mean, Sherm Cohen has always had a really firm grasp on how to make SpongeBob an appealing character, and a lot of his art is just at the top of its game in this movie. And as for season 4, it was announced on September 22nd, 2004, pretty shortly after the movie had completed production, but a few months before it was set to release. So there is a rumor floating around that it was just supposed to be the first 3 seasons and the movie, and then just completely donezo, but then the movie came around and became a big success, and Nickelodeon just had to capitalize on it. No, they were already, patching out a season 4 before the movie even released, and that is kind of evidenced in the early episodes of season 4, where they still kind of try to look like the movie, but not on as big of a budget. And yeah, regardless of how you feel about bringing the show back after the movie, it was brought back production-wise a little before the movie release. The movie didn't have much to do with the longevity of the series going forward. I mean, it was a massive success and made SpongeBob a cinematic icon as much as he was a television icon, but it didn't play as big of a role in the reason SpongeBob's still on today and the reason we still talk about it today as it being just this immense blockbuster, because even though $230 million is a massive amount, it's not as big as a major Hollywood production where if you get 500 million, that's considered lowballing it, especially these days. So just wanted to vent about that little bit of misinformation while I'm talking about the SpongeBob movie. But yeah, I mean, the SpongeBob movie was absolutely having an enormous impact on SpongeBob as a TV show going forward, as I'll talk about in later SpongeComs. And hey, if you want to talk about things that were made years ago that are still talked about now because of SpongeBob, look no further than the SpongeBob movie game, or any of the games made in the early 2000s. The most popular is Battle for Bikini Bottom these days, which was made a year before the movie, but its sort of sequel, also made by the same developer, Heavy Iron Studios, was released about a month before the movie, so a few things were spoiled by the game, but not much. So, yeah, it is kind of annoying that there were a lot of movie tie-in games in the 2000s, but so many of them just spoiled plot beats. But anyway, the game was pretty well received. It's still pretty popular today. Not as popular as Battle for Bikini Bottom, because my god did it have a difficulty spike, but I'm proud to have it in my collection, though I'm not very proud to have the European one with the boring box art that's just the movie poster. I vastly prefer the one that they actually sold down here and in North America, that is SpongeBob and Patrick dramatically running away from an explosion. That's such a good visual. I love it. But yeah, that game's pretty good. I like playing it once in a while, even though I still haven't gotten to the end because, my god, that difficulty spike. But speaking of that video game and sort of how edgy it looks just by the cover, this movie does get like pretty like serious and mature as it goes on. Obviously, to buy into that feeling of this is a sort of world and attitude unfamiliar to SpongeBob, but basically as soon as Dennis is introduced by Plankton, the tone of the movie completely shifts into something more threatening, and I really like that. It's a very gradual thing. Like, you don't notice as a kid just how dark this movie gets, because it's SpongeBob. It's supposed to be entertaining and funny, and they do sprinkle in a lot of good jokes just to keep you on board. But I was kind of curious if there was some negative reviews at the time just complaining about the darker tones, so I went to Rotten Tomatoes and looked up some of the earliest reviews for the movie back when it was brand new, fresh off the presses. The very disappointing thing about the movie's score on Rotten Tomatoes is that it's 68%, which, I mean, these days, if a movie's below 80%, that means it's dreadful, basically. But it's just because of the way Rotten Tomatoes aggregates scores. But it is an easy place to just sort of find all these old reviews and see what people thought of it at the time, and just sort of what were the problems people had with it, what were the praises. And a lot of the reviews for the SpongeBob movie, not only don't agree with them, but they are just completely and utterly baffling. Like, I don't know what angle they were coming from. I got 4 out here right out the gate immediately. One of them's from Cole Smithy. I'm not going to read that, because the less you know about Cole Smithy, the happier you are as a person. First of these, from Eric Luriok of the Greenwick Village Gazette. Take the kids whether they want to go or not. Counted as a negative review. I have no idea why. If it's sort of pleading you to take the kids, I don't know, it's doing its job, it's a kids movie. Dustin Putman of thefilmfile.com. These daffy sea creatures pale enormously next to the infinitely superior joys of The Incredibles and the Polar Express. Basically, this is just complete and utter nonsense. 2004 was a pretty competitive year for animated movies. You had The Incredibles, you had Shrek 2, you had the Polar Express. But I don't know if I'd call the Polar Express better than or as good as the SpongeBob movie. It's got a good story, but people complained about the animation in that movie even at the time, and it is always sort of a barrier for me. At least he didn't compare it to Shark Tale. I'm glad that the SpongeBob movie was able to survive the 2D animation stigma that was growing at the time with some of these, puff pieces and critics. Because basically 2004 was the complete transitional point where basically every major animated movie had to be in CGI. That was the year that Disney stopped making them annually. It was the year Shrek 2 just completely sold people on Shrek. It's the year that Pixar started taking themselves more seriously with their first PG movie. And yeah, sort of the SpongeBob movie being able to be a close competitor to those at all is a mini miracle. So I'm glad he did not compare it to Home on the Range or Shark Tale. Another one I've got as a movie, this is good TV by Mark Palermo of The Post in Nova Scotia. As a movie, this is good TV. How on earth is this counted as a negative review? I guess it is just because of the stigma of the cartoon movie adaptation that a lot of them aren't any more impressive than a movie you can get on TV for like a small cable fee. But yeah, I can kind of get why it's got that going against it as well. Just there's also some other more valid reviews, like people thinking that SpongeBob did work much better in the short format, that a movie sucked out some of its charm, some of its essence. Even though I think that all this dark stuff and all this serious stuff is them applying a movie attitude to SpongeBob rather than SpongeBob to a movie attitude. But that's just my 2 cents. I don't want to incur the wrath of any of these magazine or web critics from 2004 who were probably just kind of forced to watch a movie far outside their preferred sort of blockbuster viewing. But it is kind of interesting to see. But especially with that dark stuff, as Dennis comes into frame, it just gets more and more serious. Like, you would not believe me if I said that if you got to the scene at the Thug Tug with just this blaring heavy metal music and these people eating bowls of nails. Not just bowls of nails, bowls of nails without milk. Oh my gosh, so edgy. And all these sort of like 80s tough guys just hanging out, playing pool and beating themselves up, falling over piss drunk. It's great. It's super edgy, and I like how they put SpongeBob and Patrick in that environment, and Patrick is somehow able to fit and make a joke, and then it's got this great ending with, SpongeBob and Patrick almost, like, sort of decaying into nothing, trying to hold their breath doing the Goofy Goober theme song, and those are some of the most striking visuals of the movie to me, just how corrupted they make their faces, because as a whole the expressions in this movie are very top notch. This is exactly what I like to see out of them pushing SpongeBob. Steven Hillenburg said in an interview that this is as good as he wants SpongeBob to look, and I can definitely see that because, as I said, season 4 is one of, if not my favorite looking season, and it took a lot of influence from the SpongeBob movie. So yeah, I'm kind of on that sort of wavelength, especially when it comes to the character models and how expressive they're allowed to be, how exactly they exaggerate their features in every scene. Like, there is something lovingly hand-drawn about this movie, how in every shot, SpongeBob and Patrick look a little different depending on the exact reaction and action that they need them to perform and react to. It's beautiful, and I do really like this sort of movie and season 4 era perspective of exaggeration, and that it really is just growing or shrinking proportions and just making that alone make them weirder and perfectly reacting to a situation, as opposed to the direction they've taken in more recent seasons, in that they just flat out distort their features into making them more grotesque. And that can work occasionally. It works in small doses, like them like melting and almost exploding there at the Thug Tug. But for me, I do see the appeal in that, but I do slightly prefer this style of just making it so you never know quite how they're going to change their features slightly to make it work a little better. It is very cartoony in a sort of a good, accessible, anyone can understand why this works way, rather than the sort of borderline Ren and Stimpy style they do now, which has its place. I don't hate it as much as others do. But yeah, like after the Thug Tug, you've got that scene of Squidward like reclining on up to the chum bucket, and that's another thing I like in this movie. Just that little character moment of Squidward just heading on out in his sort of reclining bicycle, because apparently Roger Bumpus or someone has one of that. Roger Bumpus is the voice actor for Squidward, and I like how they kind of added something about the voice actor to the characters. It's sort of like how when SpongeBob goes jellyfishing, he has Tom Kenny's glasses to go along with it. Like, that's a little part of the actor rubbing off on the character, as much as the character may rub on the actor as time goes on. And yeah, that's always a nice thing to see. But yeah, then you've got that scene of them, like, sort of enslaving Squidward as this big angry mob full of bucketheads, so you don't even see their faces. I think a faceless enemy can be as freaky and effective as an extremely distorted face or an extremely threatening face. Oh, and hello to the only time card in this entire movie. It's sort of funny that they were becoming a really big thing in season 3. Like, they were doing all these sorts of meta jokes with it, and then there's only one in the movie. And I guess it's because they work better in that short form format. And yeah, I can kind of see why they cut it with the time cards and even the bubble transitions to an extent. Like, there's a couple in this movie, but yeah, not as many as on the show. And it is a little disappointing that you've got these hallmarks of SpongeBob that are not as common in the movie, but it's a movie format. They've got to change some things. And something I do really like about the threats in this movie is that they apply to the actual world of the sea. Like, you've got the Thug Tug. It's totally common for fish to just start hanging out in an abandoned ship or a sunken ship like that. And then you've got the creepy lady with the giant fish. It is totally common for, like, a predator fish to make some sort of, like, super elaborate disguise just to, ensnare its prey. And then you've got the trench coming around down here, and that is also such an excellent way to just go back to the Hadal Zone and how the deeper creatures are usually the more threatening ones and the creepier ones to see in a nature show, even if they can be kind of misunderstood. They're not all anglerfishes. It is really kind of interesting. You can kind of see Steven Hillenburg, like, putting his love for the ocean and all the threats it can bring and all the little references that you can make that only expert marine biologists could know, and putting it in this movie that's going to be screened to millions of people. Sort of a little subtle wink and a nod to people in his form of profession. It is really nice. And this movie just has an excellent sort of grasp on SpongeBob and Patrick's dynamic, because we've seen them a lot throughout the show, just going on these goofy little misadventures like in Life of Crime or something, but never to the extent of they're heading so far out that they could be in danger. They could die at any moment. And it is kind of good that they've kept their dynamic just exactly how it's worked and taken the very best moments of season 2 and 3, thought of them, and applied that dynamic to the big screen. Because the whole thing with Patrick in particular is that he and SpongeBob are the only two people who think that Patrick's any sort of genius, and they're completely false in terms of in-universe smarts, but they are, in a roundabout way, sort of right in that Patrick, at his best, is pure comic genius. You've got some of the best Patrick moments in this movie. Like, you've got the surprised Patrick face and the surprised SpongeBob face at the side of that, once you've just got this massive eel come and take the giant red fish away. It's just such a nice cap to that moment. Just seeing them just completely dumbfounded at the sheer scale of their next threat. And they even brought those faces back in the season 11 episode Scavenger Pants, and yeah, it was kind of weird to see them again there just because of how differently they drew faces at that point. But, I mean, it was good to see them again. And as for their little adventure in the trench, not only was just giving them mustaches for a few minutes just a nice change of pace, just made them feel a little more like they're learning something, even though they're not learning the right thing about themselves. It's sort of like interesting to see their perspective to danger change into something still fairly innocent. Like during the Now That We're Men song, like if they were still scared, they would have gotten eaten alive, figuratively and literally. And I mean, everyone's kind of glad that they didn't, because Now That We're Men is a dang good song. Got some good. It's a real knee slapper, you know. They got either Mark O'Hare or Kent Osborne or someone to do those slapping sound effects, and I'm so happy that they made those sound effects as real as possible and just built on them. It's just a great comedic moment, and the payoff that, you know, the sea creatures in that cave are just completely on their side for some reason. I don't know. It's kind of given away by the box art of the DVD, but the movie had already had its time in theaters by the time the DVD came out, so I don't know. Early adopter discount, I guess. But yeah, Now That We're Men is a pretty good song for other reasons. It's super, like, endearing that they used a song from their little production soundtrack library that was last used in the Great Snail Race for the theme of the event and for the title card. Just sort of wrote lyrics to it, because now you can never think of that track again without thinking of Now That We're Men. And that is just such good, like, ingenuity and such good songwriting that you can make it so memorable that you can just apply it to a musical piece that was never supposed to have lyrics. It's just pure serendipity. I love it. I mean, overall, this movie just has a really firm grasp on, like, the SpongeBob sound library and the production music they can use. Lily Hearts Club, the sort of melancholy music that they use in some episodes, I think was the best integrated into this movie, just in the scene where Mindy's trying to cheer them up. Because, I mean, it doesn't sound theatrical at all, but it perfectly fits the mood. And there are other great scenes throughout the franchise that feature it, like in Gary Takes a Bath and Can You Spare a Dime, and even Good Neighbors, depending on how you feel about that episode and the scene it's used there. But yeah, I mean, it works. It really does work. And it wouldn't be SpongeBob if it didn't have a little fun with its music. And as for voice acting in terms of the celebrities, I think Alec Baldwin gives in like the best performance as Dennis. Like you only hear little grunts or little phrases here and there for the first two-thirds of the movie, and then around here you finally get to hear him. And like Alec Baldwin had already been a pretty famous star for years and years, and here he is just giving this super menacing voice and kind of being similar to Plankton, but the total opposite in that he is tall and legitimately intimidating. And like this was also just a big year for Alec Baldwin in terms of Nickelodeon movies, because he also appeared in the Fairly Odd Parents TV movie Channel Chasers as the older Timmy Turner there. So yeah, I don't know if he was just writing letters to them daily, but yeah, he did a good job here. And here we are in Shell City. Uh, like, there's sort of a weird air to knick-knack stores like this that live so close to the ocean and just nab whatever they can without any sort of license or safety. I'm sure some people aren't as bothered by it as I am, and I don't think it's unethical or anything, but there is something a bit creepy about this Cyclops guy in particular who just it doesn't even take his helmet off. You never know who he is. It's just taking random creatures who haven't even died yet. Like SpongeBob and Patrick are not dead on the ground for him to just steal and take out of what he can't prove isn't their natural habitat, and just turning them into sort of shells of their former selves, making them vaguely marketable like souvenirs. And I don't know if this is like Steve venting about these places and this sort of creepy environment, but I can tell you that they do go back to some of the earlier like issues SpongeBob and Patrick could face for their lives with this drying out scene. The first just being taken to a gift shop in general, like in Hooky, that was their major threat before Mr. Krabs threw mayonnaise into the mix. But then you've also got Tea of the Tree Dome, only the third episode to ever air, and one of the 3 episodes to air on that very first day SpongeBob was on TV. And it really did show that dehydration is a big deal for sea creatures, that they can sort of dry up and lose their luster. And back there, it was mostly used for comedy, a bit of horror, a bit of tension, but here it's used for tragedy. It's used for this big emotional moment where SpongeBob and Patrick are basically on their deathbeds and sort of decaying and unsure if they will survive, and SpongeBob's got this big emotional speech while Patrick's just staying silly. And yeah, it is really depressing. I can see I did personally find it very sad when I was a kid, and still do today. The performances here are just impeccable. Tom Kenny and Bill Fagerbakke, they might have gotten more exaggerated over the years, definitely during this movie and after, but like they really do care about these characters and really do want them to succeed at being as, relatable as possible in any of their appearances. And this movie is just some of their best work in all their voiceover careers, and it had to be because it was the SpongeBob SquarePants movie, and it was just, it must have been absolute magic to see this on the theaters. And that's the thing, I got this movie on DVD in about 2006, but it still felt new and magical to me. I never had that experience of seeing a SpongeBob movie in the theater. I never even got to see Sponge Out of Water in the theater, and Sponge on the Run was on streaming. But yeah, this must. I do want to hear more from people who were who do remember seeing the SpongeBob movie in the theaters, what they thought of every scene as it was happening. They probably don't remember every single detail because this was nearly 20 years ago, but yeah, it was pretty. It must have been a bit overwhelming, but you've got this little pirate scene to cheer you up. You've got Steven Hillenberg's little line here. His last vocal credit on the show or in any of the media until a single word in Sponge Out of Water. And I kind of like that cameo as well. But then you've got the tear and the Goofy Goober. Just so interesting how even here they take music that they could use in the show. They even did use it for the You Wish special, and it fits perfectly for a film, even if it does kind of sound old-timey. And just sort of seeing the toys just gradually get more saturated and then pop, they're back to life. It's so gratifying, and God, you do really just want to see them succeed now. But then you've got this big old moment of the whole of Shell City coming back to life, and you've got a lot of great little visual gags here of just these creatures coming back to life to get these comeuppance on the Cyclops dude. You've got a lot of great little visual moments here. You've got the seahorses coming back to life, and that kind of puts into perspective just how big the land world is when a seahorse looks like that, when they look like these big old majestic figures when they were at Mindy's carriage. And then you've got the pufferfish coming back to life. If you ever wondered what happened to Mr. Puff, then wonder no longer. You've also got some starfish coming back to life, and they look a fair bit more realistic than Patrick, but it works. I do really like how the starfish look. And then you've got the mariachi band. I don't know if they were a mariachi band before they dried up, but I'm glad that they're enjoying some, I hope, authentic music. One scene I'm kind of glad was cut is a deleted scene on the DVD where they were just messing around with the storyboards and chicken scratch and came up with the idea that Sandy was now a live-action squirrel that had escaped and was not on land now, and shooting government agents and whatever, and Patrick vomits, and then we see human versions of SpongeBob, Patrick, and Squidward. I'm kind of... It's a very weird thing to think up, even for SpongeBob, and I'm kind of glad that it didn't get into the movie, that it was sort of left to be this burning mystery of why is Sandy even running from the government in this non-canon moment. And I can kind of get why it was cut for, standards and practices reasons. I don't know how they would feel about that scene of Patrick vomiting, and I guess the human SpongeBob and Patrick would have made things weird and removed a bit of mystery to the world, or added a bit too much mystery to it. But, looking at how they could have done Sandy dirty in this movie, I am kind of glad that they just stuck a bucket on her head, honestly. But, I'm glad that this is just a weird talking point now, and we can all come and laugh about it. And David Hasselhoff is sort of a nice moment here, too. You've got him just, for some reason, running up to SpongeBob and Patrick like he's on Baywatch. I don't even know if Baywatch was still on at the time this movie came out. But yeah, he works as this sort of weird celebrity messiah to SpongeBob and Patrick. Kind of a Deus Ex Machina in that I don't know how he could even not flip his lid at a talking sponge and starfish. But yeah, this is a lot funnier than your average Simpsons celebrity walk on, because you're taking this character actor and just making them more inherently surreal. And the funny thing about David Hasselhoff in this movie is that for these scenes, they didn't just like take David Hasselhoff and film him swimming at different angles. They used about twice the size body double of David Hasselhoff, just this model with him with a really creepy face that you never see in the movie. And I think David Hasselhoff still owns it. It might have been sold a few years ago. That might be a mismemory on my part, but yeah, it's a very wacky thing that someone's kept around, and I'm pretty glad that David Hasselhoff was completely on board with his depiction in the movie as this weirdo with CGI abs, and he kind of embraced it to the point that he came back to the show in the 20th anniversary special, and you can tell he'd gotten a bit older and didn't have those CGI abs anymore, but yeah, he's still a fun character, it seems. Besides Steven Hillenburg, there are also some very interesting cameos from the crew in this movie. Like when Dennis blows the bubble outside the Thug Tug, and it does a little giggle that's supposed to encompass both SpongeBob and Patrick. That's Aaron Springer doing that giggle as them from supposedly just like a memory of when they had their bubble party. And I do find that performance very charming in a surreal sort of way. You've got the staff writer at the time, Mike Bell, playing the fisherman, and that's also somehow a role that he's kept around since the movie. It still appears in the 20th anniversary special, I think, and The String, the season 11 finale, is one of the last living souls that SpongeBob unravels. But he doesn't do the voice of the fisherman here. That's Derek Dryman as the little whoa. And I just wanted to bring up Derek Dryman as well, because he's another unsung hero in the history of SpongeBob. Probably the most unsung history. Like, we know barely anything about him other than that he was sort of a co-developer of the show alongside Steven Hillenburg, and that he was a staff writer on those first 3 seasons and on the movie, and has basically dipped since. Like, we know that Steven Hillenburg is a bit of a hermit, well, was, and obviously for good reason. SpongeBob was just such a gigantic thing that I doubt that many people would be able to deal with it. And I kind of get that with Derek Dryman as well, because we know hardly anything about him, and honestly, I kind of want to keep it that way. Just keep it special, keep him a legend in a way. And yeah, beyond the crew's involvement in the writing and the voicing and just overall presenting this movie as something that is absolutely worth your time, I just wanted to just thank them for making such a fun movie. Even the ones that have passed on or don't work in animation anymore, or who could never see this for one reason or another, just thank you so much for the SpongeBob SquarePants movie. It's not one of my favorite movies ever, but it is such a delightful and hilarious film. And I mean, without those first 3 seasons, we wouldn't have the movie or the later seasons of the show. So I always want to keep that in mind when thinking about SpongeBob. Like, I always say about Steven Hillenburg that he wasn't the only guy to make SpongeBob great, but he was the only guy to make SpongeBob, like, bring it into existence. And for this being his last major contribution to the franchise for a pretty long time before things just got so out of hand that he had to come back in the mid 2010s. This is a pretty impressive note to leave on in terms of just giving people something very funny and charming and just something that is mostly pretty well written. Mostly because I guess there is a bit of criticism directed towards this movie. Some plot holes have opened up, some issues with the story and pacing, and for me, the biggest problem with the movie is the usage of some of the characters that aren't SpongeBob, Patrick, and Mr. Krabs. But there are other issues with like, is this ending a cop out or is it earned? Is it worth it? Is it just completely in their best interest to end the movie with David Hasselhoff saving the day and then SpongeBob completely out of nowhere singing a song and saving Bikini Bottom from Plankton's wrath? Well, for me, I kind of go back and forth on this, but at the end of the day, I don't think it's that much of a cop-out to bring David Hasselhoff in or bring Goofy Goober Rock in, because, well, we see throughout the movie that acting like a kid gets SpongeBob and Patrick into trouble, but as it goes on, it gets them out of trouble. You've got, the bubble that SpongeBob blows into Dennis's face to just sort of show that if he didn't have his bubbles on him, if he was a straight-laced grown-up man that didn't have bubbles in his pocket, then he might not have been able to stun Dennis. That's like a thought experiment, ain't it? And then you've also got this big old confrontation between SpongeBob and Plankton, and the way it kicks off is SpongeBob just childishly saying that Plankton cheated at something. And Plankton even says it himself, that it's like some kid complaining on the playground. And it isn't too childish in either of these cases either. It's just SpongeBob doing things that his target audience might do, saying things his target audience might do, having in his pocket things his target audience might have, and that is pretty cool. But then, the whole musical number, it is absolutely hilarious. I love every little moment in this musical number. Just in terms of, directing and sending the movie off on this big climax, it is really interesting and fun. And, you've got also a little bit of claymation there, a little bit of live-action stock footage with The Rock. And, if SpongeBob wasn't a Goofy Goober, then maybe, I don't know, maybe this wouldn't have happened. I'm getting pretty tired. It was probably a big mistake of me to do this all in one sitting, but here we are. I kind of feel my brain is SpongeBob scat singing here at the moment, so if you want another sync up, there you go. But yeah, I do think that each of these moments in the climax of SpongeBob saving himself in Bikini Bottom, little by little, is helped by him being a kid and having a kid-like mentality on the world. For some reason, I never noticed the crotch grab until I rewatched this movie yesterday, and I am just so surprised they were able to get away with that. But as I was saying, this just really reinforces the message of the movie that for the target audience of kids, be a kid. It's fun, it's cool. It could get you into trouble, but it can also get you out of trouble if you're wise about it. And for adults who might be watching SpongeBob because it had a pretty big adult audience by this time, stay a kid at heart if it makes you feel any better. And about this little ending after the Goofy Goober Rock ending here, I'm surprised going back that throwing Plankton in jail was at all satisfying in any way because, like, he's shown up in jail pretty frequently since about season 6. And, like, obviously, he is a massive criminal. He's probably on some sort of watch list by this point. But it is pretty interesting that, like, Plankton was allowed to roam free, do whatever he wanted for a pretty long time. But, I mean, this was a nice little way to end his, like, involvement in the movie as this sort of flattened pancake of his former self. But sort of ironic in that seeing Plankton in jail is no longer any sort of surprise. It was also kind of fun to see this iteration of King Neptune go through the slightest of story arcs. Like, I vastly prefer the King Neptune on the show now, having revisited this Neptune. But yeah, I mean, he is a little more thankful for the little creatures in the sea. He is a little nicer to his daughter Mindy. Not as much of a dictator, and he is fair and reasonable in reviving Mr. Krabs here, unfreezing him, and briefly turning him into a real boy. It's kind of weird to see Mr. Krabs as a human. I don't know. It's kind of silly, but they got their little Pinocchio slash generic fairy tale ending reference in. What I've always kind of wondered about this ending resolution scene is Patrick just, he was out of his leggings during the cutback to the Goofy Goober Rock sequence, but then he put them back on. I don't know why. I don't mind. He kind of rocks them. And also, SpongeBob just completely changes back to his normal attire here for whatever reason. I don't know how quickly they change off screen. I don't know how their in-universe director didn't catch any of these, like, continuity errors, but, you know, I think, like, a few little animation quirks here and there can be forgivable if the overall movie is a fun time, and all the great faces and movements, and especially the backgrounds and all the little things you'd never really pay that much attention to. If all of that is flat out, like, mesmerizing, then, you know, it's a pretty good movie in my book. And one little cruel thing about the end of this movie is, like, all SpongeBob wants is a managerial position at this Krusty Krab 2 that we never see again because it's the end of the timeline. We never need to have an episode about the Krusty Krab 2. It's kind of ironic that, like, a managerial job at the Krusty Krab 2 is what SpongeBob wants, and then he gets it at the end, and he's very excited, and then Ocean Man starts playing, but then you see his role at the Krusty Krab 2, and most of it is stuff that we've seen him do before, mopping the floors, and taking out the garbage, and picking gum off the tables, and swabbing the bathrooms, and this is stuff that we have seen him do in the show as just a regular employee, and I think that just goes to show how sus Mr. Krabs is as a person, as a, like, employer. If he's running a restaurant with only 3 people, and now he's running 2 restaurants with 3 people, it's kind of strange, but they don't want you to think too hard about that. They want you to think about Ocean Man, which is a very incredible song by Ween, and I am incredibly thankful that it is now associated with this wonderful film. And it is kind of nice to see a band that Steven Hillenburg really liked just be a part of the SpongeBob mythos now, because, like, the Ocean Man song had been written and released before SpongeBob even came out. Ocean Man released on CD in 1997, but they made appearances in the show afterwards. Like, you've got the shoe tying song in the season 2 premiere that was performed by Ween. So Steve definitely had a thing for their music and for experimental rock in general. If this credits sequence is anything to go by, you've also got the Psychic Wall song by the Flaming Lips, which really fits over this calming, albeit disorienting, credit sequence of live action waves tinted blue, which is super chill and super, like, relaxing to just ease you out of the SpongeBob world. I do really like it, but I do really like this movie, so yeah. And then you've got Just a Kid, written by another band, and it was written by Wilco. And it isn't based on any old random scene in the movie like the Flaming Lips song. It's just a song that they wrote that vaguely goes over the themes of the movie that, SpongeBob may be a big old man child, but whatever. He just wants to have fun. And it's kind of interesting that they made that the music that they play on the DVD menu, just sort of introducing newer generations to the movie immediately and its tone. And because, like, it's a dang good song, probably one of my favorites to ever be used on SpongeBob. And, like, that might be an unpopular opinion because I don't know if the song is, like, that well known these days, but I don't know, it is such a bop to me. And then the credits are closed out with the infamous Best Day Ever song, co-written by Tom Kenny. It's just like this very simple, sweet, saccharine, like, song from the POV of SpongeBob about how every day is super amazing, how like, even getting out of bed just puts him in a good mood. And, like, everyone says the same thing. Like, it was a fine way to close out the movie. Maybe they didn't need to make an entire episode and an entire album out of the song and its tone. And yeah, it might be a bit too childish for SpongeBob, but I'll get to that in a pretty long time from now. I just wanted to bring up all the songs used in the credits and what they mean to me personally, and that's just all I can really say about the SpongeBob SquarePants movie. Question time for you this time has nothing to do with the question I posed in my last commentary track, which was for the season 3 finale. This time I want you to answer the question of, what is your favorite SpongeBob movie? This is probably going to be the most one-sided question time I've ever had, but, there is some defense for Sponge Out of Water being a better movie than the SpongeBob movie. I think they're neck and neck, but I don't agree, but I'll get to that another day. And I'm just going to say it. If you say Sponge on the Run, you're probably just trolling. I mean, okay, maybe not. I'm probably not going to take it that seriously, but you know what I mean. You're asking for a very big debate there. But maybe you could even answer with Atlantis SquarePants or Truth or Square if you want. I mean, there's a little more defense for them these days. But as always, check the SpongeComs playlist for upcoming SpongeBob commentary tracks. For the first 3 seasons, I roughly did the commentary tracks around the time each episode turned 20 years old. I started them in celebration of SpongeBob's 20th anniversary and partly as celebration of Steven Hillenburg's life and how his show changed the world and how it changed over time and how it changed comedy, how it changed the minds of a lot of people's views on undersea life and, like, the show itself over time, and basically a lot of things. SpongeComs is about a lot of things, and a lot of it is just me rambling and stuttering, and if you enjoy that, you'll probably enjoy SpongeComs a lot. But because of the 2-year gap in production between seasons 3 and 4, because the movie had to be made, for the moment, I'm moving the commentary tracks up to the 18th anniversary of SpongeBob episodes. So the next one is going to be on May 6th, 2023 for the 18th anniversary of season 4. And what are the first 2 episodes of season 4 about? SpongeBob losing his mind and Krabs losing its skin. So join me on May 6th for the SpongeComs for Fear of a Krabby Patty and Shell of a Man. Goodbye for now.